Welcome, everyone, to the fifth ever episode of the Global Guessing Weekly Podcast. My name is Clay Graubart, and I'm joined with Andrew Eady, and this is the podcast on all things forecasting and geopolitics. This week is a special week for three reasons. First of all, there's no guest. Second of all, it's going to be a shorter episode because, number three, Andrew Eady has a brand new microphone. Andrew, say hello with the new mic.
Well, first, I was going to say that was a great intro. I like that little pause during the intro, a lot of suspense, so great job. But also, yeah, happy to have some updated audio for all the listeners, upgraded audio rather. Um, and yeah, I mean, honestly, I think by episode 100, we're just going to be in robot suits. I think we're just going to keep upgrading our tech as much as possible. So excited for that.
Yeah, well, next week or the week after, I should be getting a new microphone setup, and then the only thing that's missing is getting you a slightly better webcam. I say there's just a slight difference if you're a video viewer between the video quality between myself and Andrew. Just a little bit.
You're not mistaken. Yes, yeah, that's the next investment. Gonna have to move around some finances, but we'll make it work.
Well, speaking of investments and finances, in this week, because we're
Great
gonna have a
segue.
shorter episode, we're gonna just focus on sort of three or four main things. I think the first one we want to talk about is a book that we talked about, I think, in the first episode of the podcast. Um, this book right here, Geopolitical Alpha by Marco Popic. Marco, if you guys did not see on Twitter, was really kind enough to send us two signed copies of his book, um,
It's pretty
which is
sick.
which is super awesome of him. And both Andrew and myself finished the book. I think we should give just sort of like a brief summary about what the book was about, and then sort of just give some of our initial thoughts. If you guys are readers of our website, you guys can stay tuned for sort of a larger book review on the website, but we just wanted to give sort of our initial thoughts now that we finished the book. Andrew, do you want to give us a little summary of what sort of Marco's thesis is in this book and what he tries to argue for?
Yeah, I mean, I think sort of from a very high level, Marco basically paints this picture where he says, for the past 10 or 20 years, markets have been pretty frothy. They've been going up, and investors haven't had to really worry about any other exogenous factors outside of the markets to generate alpha and to make investment decisions. But now things are very different. Things have changed, as you've seen with the volatility in the markets recently. Um, Markets aren't just going up, and you have to take into account a lot of other factors if you want to generate alpha and make smart decisions. And Marco argues that geopolitical analysis, understanding, the role of states within the global arena, but also how geopolitical tensions and geopolitical dynamics can affect domestic economics, is becoming not just a nice to have, but a need to have. And so he basically lays out frameworks and ways that you can try and forecast geopolitical events and also understand which ones are important and which ones aren't when it comes to your own investments and money. And so for us, I mean, we're forecasting geopolitics every week, but sort of getting a better understanding of how we can tie those forecasts to more actionable, more practical um, sort of scenarios is was really interesting to read. So
Now,
yeah, I don't know
Andrew,
if
when
you
it
have.
comes to his sort of thesis, right, most sort of
Mhm.
geopolitical analysis that I've seen when it comes to finance is sort of the Ian Bremmer Eurasia Group type of analysis, where you focus on sort of what the situation is, you examine who the actors are and what their sort of beliefs and interests are in the area, as well as talking about sort of the sort of reality on the ground. And does Marco sort of take that approach in the book? I mean, I know the answer, but sort of what is the approach that he takes for that, and does it differ at all from the sort of classical sort of way in which geopolitics has been thought about in investment decisions?
You really teed that up there, didn't you? I mean, listen, yeah, I think there's a whole school. Well, actually, it's interesting. I think, you know, as you said, and you made it pretty clear, Marco's approach to forecasting geopolitical events definitely differs from the way that Ian Bremmer talks about geopolitics and how it affects, markets and economics. Um, but funny enough, I mean, Marco, as he writes in his book, is a student of George Friedman, who, founded the Stratfor Group 2 years before the Eurasia Group came about. So I can't even really chalk it up to age or era as to why Marco and Ian's philosophies towards forecasting differ so much. But yeah, as you said, we'll get to the point. What Marco sort of proposes in his book is something that he calls the constraint framework, and you've probably read a lot about it through our podcast, or through our articles and listened to it on our podcast. But basically, it postulates that the preferences of leaders and the preferences of individuals in general come secondary to the constraints under which those individuals are acting. And so basically, even if let's say Biden wants to take a certain action or pass a certain piece of legislation, based on various political constraints, economic constraints, he may not be able to. And so that ultimately will be the best sort of diagnostic in order to understand what might happen in the future.
Yeah, there's a certain phrase that Marco repeats repeatedly in his book. Is sort of
Yes, he has a slogan.
his maxim, his categorical imperative for investing and making forecasts based on geopolitics. Preferences are optional and subject to constraints, whereas constraints are neither optional nor subject to preferences. And so, sort of like, I mean, I think a lot of what comes out of this book and why I don't think we're necessarily the target audience is something that we sort of implicitly do in our forecast. But it's this idea that, like, at the end of the day, you can feel however you want, but there are just certain material and sort of human constraints that are on decision makers and leaders, and that ultimately is the key driver in terms of how geopolitical events will come out. It's not to say
Hmm.
that sort of preferences don't matter, and funny enough, in a later chapter, he talks about the ways in which preferences sort of do show themselves. The
Right.
biggest one being that it sort of runs out the clock on events, but that also preferences of the individuals that leaders serve matter as well. So it's not that preferences don't matter, but it's that when you're looking at a sort of any sort of geopolitical situation and trying to forecast what will happen, it's those constraints at the end of the day that are your first factor that you should be considering. It's not that preferences don't come in, but if you were to only do a forecast based on a single thing, you would do constraints over preferences or ideas. And I think sort of that resonated well with both of us quite well in the book. Um, but I was wondering, were there any things in the book that sort of caught your eye as sort of like that didn't resonate as well? That there were things that you read that you might have disagreed with?
Sure. I think whenever you're talking about geopolitics, even between us, we have disagreements all the time about, the role of certain states or what certain states are trying to do within the global arena. I think a lot of that stems from the fact that, information is asymmetric or is hidden. And so, we only are working with limited information, and we all take in that information differently. So we're going to have different outlooks. I think one of the things that stuck out to me um, a lot was he wrote about, I think sort of in the second half of the book, he was talking a lot about the effects of living in a increasingly multipolar world. Um, and I think that's been something that is pretty heavily discussed these days, is sort of how power is being more and more disparately spread around the globe. But I think some of the times that he was talking about, a multipolar world, it felt like he was conflating multipolar with just globalized. So like some of the examples he was giving of um, some of these polls, that he thought were had been cropping up over the last decade or so, I didn't see as really poles of power so much as just the result of the world being more interconnected and economies being more connected and countries becoming more prosperous, sort of just a natural progression of civilization, so to speak. So I mean, I think it may seem small, but if he sees certain countries as these bastions of power potentially very threatening, and I see them as um, I don't know, maybe less so. I think that can definitely shape the way that you see the role of other countries, see sort of the puzzle pieces of the world in general. So that's something that stood out to me. I don't know if you had thoughts or things that
Yeah,
you
I
had
think
picked out.
yeah, sort of on like the same level. I think when it comes to the framework, there's sort of little squibbles in terms of like importance and sort of like the order of operations of things. Um,
Yep.
Sort of like the main issues, not issues, but things I sort of disagreed with in the book yeah, it did sort of stem from the sort of political analysis, which I think at first for me was like a much bigger factor in terms of how I viewed this book, but I've sort of learned to sort of like separate the two things. There's sort of Marco giving the sort of geopolitical analysis, and then there's Marco um, giving a framework that we can apply to sort of do our own analysis. In the same way that, for instance, we used root claims analysis on one of our most recent forecasts, but received an entirely different outcome. I kind of view that Marco with his framework versus his sort of geopolitical analysis. Like we can talk
Yeah.
about, he talks about how bipolarity is the most stable form of states, which means that basically when the international system is dominated by just two really powerful states, so think the Cold War with the US and the Soviet Union as being the
So yeah,
most
could you just
stable.
run down really quickly, sort of unipolar, bipolar, and multipolar? I realize we've been throwing around these terms a lot, and if you studied
Yeah,
political
yeah,
science, you know what
that's
it means. But
that's definitely a good point.
if you haven't,
So unipolarity is this idea that there's a single dominant state in the system, that no other state can challenge it, nor could a sort of a collection of states even challenge a single state. They are they are undisputed in the state and can more or less guide the entire international system by themselves.
yep,
Um, the example that people give of a unipolar moment is sort of the post Cold War period, and around until the U.S. withdrawal out of the Middle East. There really isn't a clear point. The whole unipolar moment is subject for
I'd say
another
around
day.
2003 is, but yeah, it is
We'll talk about
controversial.
unipolarity and that whole analysis issue later. But
Yeah,
that's
if
one
people want to
thing.
get into theory, by the way, please comment below because we love this stuff and it's really fascinating. But yeah, continue.
Then bipolarity is when there's two dominant states. This is really best thought of as sort of the immediate post World War II period, where the U.S. and Soviet Union were really the only two dominant players. Um, it's commonly thought of as being the entire Cold War, although by the 70s, China is arguably a, a sort of third wheel player, which brings us to tripolarity, which is when there's two dominant states and then like a third swing state that can kind of swing the balance of power, which side is the most dominant, by picking a side. This is most commonly thought of in the later parts of the Cold War, with the US and Soviet Union being the two big dogs and China being that third wheel. And when it switched from being under sort of the Soviet control to Nixon's sort of opening up of China, swing China over to the US's side and therefore fundamentally tilting the balance of power. And then you have multipolarity, which is basically saying like no one's powerful enough.
Yep,
Power is relatively well distributed amongst the states. Um, but those terms are also always fit to meet people's papers and what's required to sort of make their
right.
argument a lot of the time. But that's sort of the general idea. Um,
Thank you.
yeah, so I think, right, as I was saying, his argument that bipolarity is the most stable, there's game theory analysis that says tripolarity in the example I gave with the two dominant and the swing state is actually the most stable. But it's things like that that were like sort of small issues. And I think if you can kind of separate the political analysis and really focus on the framework, you can get a lot out of this book. And we'll talk more about it in our review. I think my other big complaint was the idea of attaching numbers to forecasts and giving estimates on probability was sort of shunned
Mhm.
away to the last chapter and not something that he practiced in the book. For instance, he gives a forecast in this book that he expected 1.5 to 3 trillion dollars of US stimulus by the end of 2020 and we only got 900 billion only. But
You know,
that's a technically a forecast gone wrong, but it's a forecast that's kind of hard to place when there wasn't a and
probability given with it.
exactly. Um,
Yep.
but yeah, I think we'll talk about this book some more on global guessing when we give it a full review.
Very
And you can
nice.
see it here. It's on Amazon. It's actually on sale right now for $18. I think if you're interested in finding a way to sort of quickly operationalize geopolitical forecasts into investment decisions, this is a really good book to pick up. And
Yep.
I would recommend it.
And he also does give sort of a very brief geo or just political science crash course 101 in the book. So a lot of these terms that we're talking about and more will be discussed there. So don't worry if you have no political science background. It's a pretty accessible read.
And he's a pretty funny author. Although, speaking of funny
Yeah.
authors, we want to talk about some other books that we're reading. And I'm currently reading Think Again by Adam Grant. Didn't know who Adam Grant was before I read this book. Apparently, a pretty big deal. He's a Wharton professor. And it's sort of a sort of Philip Tetlocky super forecasting type book. The sort of main idea is how do you get people to sort of rethink beliefs and sort of update their thought processes um, to sort of reach better outcomes. I'm about 40% of the book, and I personally find him hilarious. Like, I am laughing quite a bit at this book. Um,
Good. He seems like a funny guy.
yeah, he at least I find him, I mean, phenomenal. And the subject actually of this book is quite useful. Like one thing he talks about is when you're having arguments to try to improve a process, don't talk about the why, instead talk about the how and sort of the process that you're trying to achieve and how you will do it. And that's it seems sort of like a small difference talking about why one thing is better than the other rather than how you'll achieve something. But I found like I use that sort of rhetorical switch of changing from why to how at work recently and found it to be really successful in terms of getting us to move on from disagreement towards finding and actually quickly reaching a solution to a problem that before was trending towards getting personal insults. They were like probably like 3 or 4 Slack messages away in terms
Yeah.
of getting to that
Been
point.
there.
And then, switching it to this, how do we deal with this how, was really useful. And we'll talk more about it, especially as I read the book and become more comfortable talking about its contents. But I've really been enjoying reading this book. And then I know you have a book to talk about, but just one other one that I'm reading right now is
Yeah.
Steven Pinker's Sense of Style.
Oh boy.
um, it's a style book. Just tips on writing better. Pinker sort of talks about how it's commonly thought of just good writers are just have like a natural talent for writing, and that's sort of the secret sauce. And this book is sort of his attempt to break down linguistically, psychologically, and just in terms of breaking down prose, in terms of why some writing passages are really good. It's a surprisingly long book for what it's at. I kind of picked it up thinking, yeah, I can read this and it'll go by pretty quick, but it's kind of a long book, but I enjoy it. I am also biased towards Pinker, but
I was about to say, if you've only listened to the Global Guessing Weekly podcast but haven't visited the site and read our book reviews, Clay is a massive Pinker fanboy, and rightly so. He's done some great stuff. We've definitely talked about it and used it in some of our analyses in the past, but it needs to be said.
Andrew, what book are you currently reading right now that you've finished Geopolitical Alpha?
Yeah, so I mean, you sort of covered the forecasty side of literature in terms of the books that you just talked about. The book I'm reading is more on the geopolitical side. Um, the title is a mouthful. It's called Black Wave, but it's called Black Wave: colon, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the 40-year rivalry that unraveled culture, religion, and collective memory in the Middle East. It's a
That's an
long
academic
title.
title. That's an academic title if I've ever
I know
seen
it sounds
one.
like a thesis. It sounds like a thesis title. But basically, it is a sort of a retelling of the events that occurred um, in and around 1979 in Iran that led up to the Iranian Revolution. Um, and through anecdotes and stories, through historical tellings, the author sort of explains how that year, 1979, completely upended the Middle East. And whereas before, Iran and Saudi Arabia were sort of the two pillars of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, the U.S. had put a leader in charge in Iran back in the 50s, and they were pretty happy with how Iran was progressing. And obviously, the U.S. and Saudi Arabia have been close for a while. But the Iranian Revolution in 79 was a threat to Saudi Arabia, a threat to U.S. influence in the region. Obviously, also Iran is a predominantly Shia Arab state as opposed to a lot of its neighbors, and so that was also something that was concerning. And so, just talking about that one year and how the ripple effects from that year led to where we are today, where when we think of the Middle East, it's In a lot of regions, it's in shambles, but before that, it was, super vibrant, and it still is in a lot of places, but, even more so is, in Lebanon, for example, super vibrant, lots of culture, concerts, music, artists would go there, expats, um, and now, they're most recently there was that awful explosion. So, um, I think it's always interesting to read those stories and sort of get perspective, um, of a region when it existed in a way completely different to how, we've known it since we've been born and growing up. So yeah, I'm excited to keep reading that book and see how it goes, but it's interesting.
Do you think there's sort of anything useful in that that tells you about sort of like the modern day situation in the region and sort of any of our forecasts, whether that's, you know, Saudi-Israeli normalization or JCPOA, or is this sort of more just giving you a different perspective on the region that is um, more like
Yeah,
historically useful rather than temporarily forecasty useful?
so I think, we've talked a lot about going back to the constraint framework, we've talked a lot about sort of economic constraints and political constraints, that exist on certain individuals and countries. What this book is teaching me is that I think, historical constraints, and we've sort of gotten into it a bit, thinking about sort of like the normalization of certain relations and how that might affect historical, ties between Saudi Arabia being like, the homeland of Islam, having Mecca and Medina. But I think historical constraints are very real. Um, and I think that, as you use the constraint framework, there's something you should take into account. And I think this book definitely highlights that in the way that, just shows the path of how we got to where we are today.
Well, do you recommend that I check this book out, or is this a finish and then let me know? The
I
initial
mean,
take in terms of scale of 1 to 10? Always got
listen,
to quantify things.
it has value as sort of an academic text and also just as an interesting story because it does sort of read like a narrative, in a lot of parts. So I'd say if you have time, definitely pick it up, see if the voice sort of speaks to you. But I find it really interesting. Um, yeah, I liked it quite a bit.
Um, and now we want to move on to giving a little bit of commentary on this week's news and geopolitics. I'm going to be completely honest. It's been another very busy week at work, which means I have not kept up to date as much as I have with the geopolitical news this week. So, Andrew, why don't you lead us into our first story?
Yeah, so there's three stories we're going to be talking about today, that we thought were interesting, relevant to prior predictions that we've made. Just things that we'd want to keep an eye on moving forward. And the first story is about, no shocker, North Korea. They always seem to be, sort of on our minds, whether it's in a forecast or in a news from the past week in geopolitics. But things seem to be escalating, if not practically, I think actually, just verbally. But one of the headlines that I saw that I thought was that sort of spoke to that. The headline read is in the New York Post. It said Defense Secretary Austin to North Korea, U.S. is ready to fight tonight.
Oh
And I
boy, we're
think
bringing
for
in
a
the New
lot
York
of
Post
people,
for some analysis. Woof.
and well, so I think it's less the, hard hitting analysis that caught my eye with this piece. Um, But more so, you have a new defense secretary in office, a new secretary of state in office, a new president in office, and a country, that has, albeit not in the past few years, since, we said 2017 in our forecast, but has been, pretty antagonistic to the West in general and to the US more specifically. And the fact that we're at a point now, when there's been sort of ebbs and flows and tensions with North Korea, where the defense secretary is saying, we're ready to fight tonight, even if he is just posturing and trying to scare North Korea from doing anything stupid, um, it still
Yeah.
is
Yeah, no,
a
that makes a
pretty
lot of
strong
sense.
signal.
Yeah, I mean, I know I was mostly kidding about the New York Post because, um, as we said in our initial forecast, when we had forecasted whether or not North Korea will test an ICBM this year, was that there's this website called 38north.org, which is, at least in the forecasting community, seems to be a pretty trusted source for North Korean news. And one of their most recent analyses was saying sort of the North Korean rhetoric right now about testing ICBMs and the harsh stuff is really just to sort of test the Biden administration. and see what kind of response that they want in the future with the North Korean US relationship. And so, yeah, something like Defense Secretary Austin's comments, I think, are important in that regard, as were Blinken's comments recently in South Korea. Um, you know, I think sort of it'll be interesting to see how the rhetoric changes over these next few months and whether or not it leads towards a ICBM or nuclear test being more likely this year or not. Because, we gave it, I think, roughly a 30% chance of occurring this year, that North Korea tests an ICBM. And I think we're sort of in the months that'll determine whether or not that number goes up or down. And to
Agreed.
see the sort of response that both Kim Jong Un and the foreign ministry and the secretary of the foreign ministry in North Korea sort of responds towards U.S. actions and U.S. rhetoric, more importantly, um, in the region. And so, yeah, we're kind of in that period right now that'll sort of determine if her forecast was in the right direction or the wrong direction, and that's interesting. I think from at least a forecasting perspective, to see does North Korea start prepping for an ICBM test? They had mentioned that earlier, but they say quite a few things. So are they now going to start taking the concrete steps towards testing their new what Hwasong 16, I believe, is the number of the missile that they're testing right now. And we would know in advance because the missile is ginormous. I think it's like the biggest ICBM by like 3x. So you would be able to see in advance if they're going to fuel it up and test it. Um, so that'll be interesting to see. Do you have any sort of
Yeah,
expectations on how this will play out?
a little bit. So I think that, we've talked a lot about negotiations with Iran and the JCPOA. I think North Korea will be looking to those negotiations to see what sort of deal the US is able to strike with Iran regarding their own sort
Mm.
of nuclear facilities. And I think if they are not happy with those terms or wouldn't want to, enter into a similar agreement, we might see at least the gearing up for missile tests as sort of a negotiation tactic, to try and get the US to maybe concede more to North Korea if they do want to. I'm not even sure that a agreement like that is even in the plans with North Korea. Obviously North Korea has a very different relationship with the US than Iran does. Um, but yeah, I'll definitely
Yeah,
be watching to
yeah.
see how those two events sort of play out because they seem to be running parallel at the moment.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting because Blinken in South Korea, went back to the General Obama era and previous sort of stance on North Korea, which is they should denuclearize and that China should help. Um,
Yep.
and what's interesting about sort of asking China to help is the sort of other major geopolitical news that happened this week, which was the summit meeting between Secretary Blinken, National Security Advisor Sullivan, and their counterparts in China, which happened in Alaska this past week. And you know, not necessarily surprising, but still of consequence, was what happened at the conference, which is to say that both sides, verbally were kind of going at one another and didn't end the summit on terms that I think anyone would indicate that, US China rapprochement, or the easing of relations is happening anytime soon. And so
Yep.
before we just talk about that in of itself, when it comes to North Korea, if the U.S. is trying to say, "Hey, we want to rely on China to help denuclearize and handle the North Korean situation," and they just had this sort of summit that ended and started and was conducted, basically just was not good in terms of U.S. China relations. Um, what does that say about North Korea's sort of latitude when it comes towards testing an ICBM? Um,
I think they can move with some confidence right now. The US is stretched thin. The world is dealing with COVID.
and China's not.
US China relation China's not, and US China relations, as you just said, there seems to be some tension there. So if the US is, best potential ally in the region to quell North Korean aggression, is not really their friend right now. And the US has other issues to worry about, other nuclear level issues to worry about, like with Iran. I think you might see North Korea sort of, I don't know, spread their wings, see what they can do with their, as you said, with their sort of room that they've been given. Um, so I think you're right. We might see some more tests in the near future. And if not, because it's also a new president, they probably want to see how he would react to something like that. Um, so I think there's a lot of reasons why, yeah, we
The U.S.
might
being
see some
stretched thin,
ICBM
yeah,
tests.
I didn't even put that together, but as a country, the United States is pretty stretched thin right now.
We're dealing with a
Whether it
lot,
comes towards, dealing with the myriad of domestic issues or
right?
internationally, it's not like internationally things are going swimmingly for the U.S., and there's a lot it has to do. Um, and, if
All
the
on top
U,
of trying to, like focus on ourselves, right? And be less involved on the international, stage. There's a lot of stuff going on, a lot of dissonance.
Yeah, and then you have the whole whether or not the United States will stay in Afghanistan or not. Because I think that also has implications, right? If the U.S. stays in Afghanistan and everything else, it's still engaged in all of its other fronts, does the U.S. have the same attention span during a pandemic to deal with a North Korea that decides to test an ICBM? That's maybe
It's a it's a potential constraint. If we're to think about what's going to happen with North Korea, one of the constraints might just be that
U.S.
there are other
attention.
things. Yeah, U.S. attention. There's other things above North Korea on the list right now, given that North Korea has been sort of in this holding pattern of aggression for a long time now, that the
Since the
U.S. has to deal
50s.
with. Yeah. So I mean, yeah, we'll see. Definitely something we'll be keeping an eye out for. Um, but then also, as you just mentioned, with the U.S. pulling out of Afghanistan, that is the third story that we wanted to talk about, in terms of things we've been watching this week. And the story being that the Afghan government, and the Taliban have agreed to accelerate peace talks, after they had their own summit in Moscow last week. Um, this is something that we had done a prediction on as well, on Matekas, I think maybe 2 episodes ago. I mean, 2 volumes ago, rather.
Probably around there.
I think that's right. Yeah. And the summit, had representation from, obviously the Taliban and the Afghan government, but also, even though they might not have all been there, the United States, Pakistan, China, Russia, a lot of other, parties that are very much vested in the outcome of that relationship. Um, and I mean, from the quotes that I've been reading coming out of that summit, people saying that they have expressed their readiness to accelerate the peace process, makes me think that one, there are probably some back channel dealings, that led to this sort of new orientation towards peace talks, because both parties weren't always so eager to get along, a few weeks ago. But I think also a great sign that U.S. troops may indeed be coming out of Afghanistan, because Biden has a bit more certainty that when he leaves, things won't all collapse.
The question though is right that May 1st deadline. I am
Right.
pretty sure that U.S. troops will be out end of year, and by pretty sure I'm
Hmm.
saying that intentionally vaguely because I don't even know internally what my confidence is on that. More than 50, but um, I don't know how much higher than that. Which
Yep.
is, we say 90% in our forecast that the troops will stay in by May 1st. So clearly that's a pretty big shift between May 1st and the end of the year.
Right.
And Politico just today actually, in their most recent playbook, it's titled "Biden Gets His Chance in Afghanistan," and I think that's really interesting because we started off this podcast talking about the difference between constraints and preferences. Biden clearly has a preference for not being in Afghanistan any longer.
Yes.
Constraint wise, though, even with that development on peace talks, will that happen by May 1st? Um, it's
I
still
mean, maybe the
really, really
chances go up.
close.
Yeah, I think maybe chances go up because obviously talks have been accelerated, and that's, a sign that there's a higher chance things might happen sooner. However, I still think, the time constraints that we brought up in our article, um, still apply and are still going to make it a bit too difficult to get this over the line.
Or maybe actually the
Um,
chances go down, right? If they've agreed to accelerating peace talks, but previously there were no peace talks, you don't just like I I don't I've never participated in peace talks, but it doesn't seem like you like meet for like a weekend and then like say, "Hey, peace." Right? There's like a process that clearly will take time even just for ratification. And so
Right.
maybe agreeing to peace talks means it's the US troops will almost certainly stay, but that they're going to be gone by like July, May, June or June. Um, just because there needs to be at least a period to have it. I mean, I know we have a month and a quarter between May 1st and now, but it's still a pretty short time period. And so if they've agreed to peace talks, maybe they'll then agree to the Biden summit, which would then entail a slight extension of troop withdrawal. And therefore, the troops stay in after May 1st, but they're pretty gone thereafter. I think that's probably
Yeah.
another way of viewing that news as well.
And also thinking about constraints, right? Like just because the leaders of, the Taliban and the leaders of the Afghan government who have been present at these summit talks have a preference to have peace, there may be constraints from their constituencies that make them have certain issues that they're not willing to concede on, or certain things that are going to be big obstacles in the peace talks, and that might end up slowing things down, as we said, definitely beyond that May 1st point. So, um, obviously there seems to be movement there. We'll definitely be keeping an eye out on that as well, um, and we'll see what happens. But yeah, I don't know. I think in general peace is good. Biden has to be happy with that result. He seems to be just like a peace purveyor around the world. He wants to get out of places and have people stop fighting. So yeah,
Just wants
we'll
everyone to
see
get
what happens.
along.
Yeah, just happy go lucky.
And so
Um,
I think, yeah, for the sort of the last topic in this week's episode, we want to give you guys a little preview on what's to come for global guessing. And sort of the
yes,
first big one is that our next election forecast is on its way. And we are going to be
it's been a
doing it
while.
on the 2021 Peruvian election. And there's a few reasons why. Um, First of all, it is a very close election. This, if you guys are watching the video, what you will see here is the opinion polling um, in Peru before on the election. And as you can see, I mean, it's a pretty crowded, unclear field with, as of right now, no one breaking 12% in the current approval rating, which is you know, that tells you it's a pretty unclear fate, which will be really fun to forecast.
Yeah.
Um, and what also makes it interesting is sort of who is rising in the polls. And I believe Popular Action, when I was doing my research earlier, although it might be Popular Renewal, is a sort of far right party in Peru, which therefore has clear geopolitical importance. But what's
Yep.
also really cool about Peru, not cool, but notable about Peru, is that unlike all of our other forecasts, they have a history of really close elections. As you can see if you're watching the stream in 2016, final results was 50.1 to 49.9. In 2011, okay, a little bit different, 51.45% versus 48.55%. But all that's to say is that this is a much closer election than we've generally been forecasting in the past, and so I think that in of itself will be exciting. What also
And sort
makes
of
it
to,
exciting, sort of number
yeah, go ahead.
two, and then we'll talk about sort of the economics of it, which makes it interesting, is that forecasting the Peruvian election is on Predict It, so we can bet on this election. And we are going to bet on this election. We are going to make a forecast, and then we're going to put money on it, which I think will be a pretty exciting thing to do. And how much we want to bet? We it definitely has to be significant enough that like it's clear that
Well,
we have
right. The
faith behind our forecast because we could bet $5 and we wouldn't really care one way or another. So we
No,
definitely need some skin
100%.
in the game.
And also,
100%.
I mean, the shares on Predicted are pretty cheap compared to your average share on the Nasdaq or the New York
GameStop,
Stock
that's
Exchange.
expensive.
Let's not talk about GameStop. But yeah, I
He
think
likes the stock.
putting down maybe a few $100s and see what happens. Or I
Yeah.
guess not going to see what happens. It's going to be so basically what's going to happen is we are going to actually run our prediction, do our analysis, make a bet on predict it, and then we will disclose how much we ended up betting, and sort of what the shares traded and stuff were in that prediction article. Um, so we have to mull it over, but yeah, it'll definitely
I
be a
think we
fun
should set a
one.
budget and then sort of do a forecast when the first initial forecast comes in, and then update it as we get closer to the election date.
And the
Um,
budget will be funded by Patreon. Just kidding.
we
Yeah,
should
no, I
set
think
one of
that's a
those
good
up
plan.
eventually. But the election's also important for economic reasons. And Andrew, you know the most about this, so why don't you give us a little rundown real quick?
Yeah, I mean, it's really just an emphasis of what you were talking about, Clay, with just the history of uncertainty and proving elections. Investors seem to be equally uncertain about the outcome of this election, especially given the potential um, sort of right wing swing as you're discussing, and so that's had an effect on Peru's currency, the Sol, SOL, not SOUL, and since the start of last year, it's actually lost 12% of its value against the dollar. So it is now, I think it's 3.7 Sol is equal to $1. Um, and it's actually trending downwards as well. And so that's something um, that's been a concern for both investors in Peru and also investors in emerging markets writ large, um, because emerging markets, typically less so this year than in 2020, but are typically pretty volatile investment options. And so um, there's going to be a lot riding on this election, especially as it gets closer and more opinion polling starts to come out and people start to sort of build a clear uh, perspective on what's going to be happening in Peru. Um, so hopefully we'll be able to provide some valuable analysis towards that end as well
Can we
when we
make a
release
trade
our
on that?
prediction.
I think we should also then try to make a trade on Forex if we can sort of have confidence in our analysis. I think that would also be really compelling.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's a good idea. And if people want to see some sort of technical charts, want to talk about, you know, potential commodity trades that can come out of some of these predictions as well, stuff like that. Definitely comment down below. But Clay, I think you're right. Um, Trading on the forex markets could be an interesting play here.
And that seems like a really adult thing to do. You know, sure,
It's
everyone has
it's either an
shares,
adult
but
thing or a very scammy thing. Everybody's a
a
forex trader as well.
little of both. A little bit of A, a little bit of
Um,
B. And then we have some
and so we
other
also,
interest. Yeah,
yeah,
we have some other really interesting things coming up. If you guys, are readers of our website, globalguessing.com, our first interview was with a super forecaster named Regina Joseph. She, along with her business partner, created this company called Pitho, which is running a U.S. government-funded study on forecasting um, COVID-related and medical-related forecasts. And we are going to have them on the podcast in 2 weeks to talk about this human forest project that they have. And Pavel, her business partner, who is also a super forecaster, I'm pretty sure, he is also going to be sitting down with us the week after that to talk about his background, his experience forecasting, and get his sort of take on things. But the next week on this podcast, we are going to be sitting down with the founder of Root Claim, which was a website we talked about on the Global Guessing Weekly podcast, episode 3, and that we also talked about in the most recent volume of Metaculus Monday. It's a really interesting website. It's one that we think is interesting for quite a few reasons, and that we are really excited to be sitting down with the founder of the website to talk about the website, to talk about its method, and to talk about some of its more controversial forecasts. And I think that'll be a really interesting podcast because not only does he have this great forecasting background, but he's also a serial entrepreneur in Israel that's been really successful selling companies to PayPal and Oracle and whatnot. And so I think that'll be a pretty exciting uh, Global Guessing Weekly podcast episode.
definitely. And then also, if you've been following our work with Ross,
Who's Ross, by the way?
Ross C, the founder of AR Global Security.
That Ross, yeah.
We started off our collaboration with Ross uh, over TikTok. We made a TikTok video. You can go check it out on his TikTok page and go follow him. Um, about the Portuguese election that we did a while back now. It feels it hasn't even been that long. And we actually had him on the last episode of the Global Guessing Weekly podcast as well. And we plan on potentially doing a new joint podcast with Ross, potentially on a separate channel, talking a lot more about geopolitics and some of the theory and some of the stuff about hybrid warfare that we got into in our last podcast episode. So that's really exciting. And just more, TikTok videos, more collaboration in general. He's a great guy. We've really enjoyed working with him. And I think the content that's come out of it has been really, really great. It's our best performing video so far on the channel. You guys should all watch it if you haven't seen it. And yeah, we're excited to do some more collaboration there.
All right, and I think that is going to be all for this week's episode of the Global Guessing Weekly podcast. I want to say it's being cut short, but it is 45 minutes, which was the length of the first episode. If you guys are mad that the episode is too short, blame Andrew for not knowing what phantom power is on his microphone. Like a noob.
Yes,
Am
but
I
now
right,
it's all
guys?
set up. I promise.
All
Oh
right.
man,
And if you guys have any ideas about topics that you want us to talk about on the podcast, guests that you would like to have
guests
on,
exactly.
please be reasonable with the guests. I don't think we're going to get the Secretary of State next week. Although, if you know
Not with
someone
that
in the State
attitude.
Department, let us know. And we'll definitely give a great interview with Blinken. We will make him make some tough forecasts if we get him on the
That's right.
podcast.
Well, that could have national security implications, so maybe not, but we'll see.
Maybe not. Okay. Well, everyone, that is episode 5. I think I've been saying episode 4. That is episode 5 of the Global Guessing Weekly podcast. My name is Clay,
I'm Andrew.
and that's the show. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.